All right, we'll kick this off here. For those of you who may not be familiar with the work that we do at Connecticut Fund for the Environment, Save the Sound, we lead environmental action in the Long Island Sound region. We fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the sound and its rivers, and work with nature to restore ecosystems. So we really work across the board with four main program areas, and the one that we're focused on today here is climate. So our climate program is really focused on action, bold action, through policy leadership and on the ground projects that help neighborhoods and ecosystems adapt to escalating climate threats. So within that context, Charles is going to give you an update on how that work, that policy work in particular, is going right now as we are wading our way through the Connecticut legislative session. So without further ado, Charles, go ahead.
Thanks, Anthony. Hello and welcome, everybody. So I'm pleased that you could all join us here. And even as we face sort of ongoing challenges with the coronavirus threat, we still have to be cognizant of the continuing threat of climate change that is not going away or taking a back seat because of the specific issues that we're facing today. And I think we all know the statistics. July 2019 was the hottest month on record globally since we started taking formal temperature records. And that just continues a trend that we've seen over at least the last 5 years. We're all familiar with 2018's hurricane season, which inflicted roughly $50 billion in damages on the areas that were hit by that. And as we've watched the news, we know that our wildfire seasons, both here in California and the West Coast, as well as what they're dealing with in Australia, are just becoming increasingly catastrophic, both in terms of property loss and what that means for human life as well. So clear that we still need to be addressing these challenges. We are being impacted here in Connecticut, just as jurisdictions around the world are. We continue to work with the legislature and with the regulatory authorities. This year, because of the coronavirus, has faced some challenges. So this is a brief timeline of the 2020 session. By the state constitution, even year sessions are short sessions. This one convened on February 5th and was set to adjourn May 6th. However, with the current crisis, legislative leadership decided to suspend business on March 12th. And while they are currently scheduled to resume on March 30th, that is still very much up in the air. As I think all the local jurisdictions are reassessing on a day-by-day basis with respect to what measures are necessary to keep everybody safe. No firm decision has been made about whether they actually will return on March 30th. That's still the date, but they will reassess in the coming days. And if they do come back, it's still somewhat up in the air about how that legislative business will proceed. I've shared with you some of the relevant committee deadlines in terms of various climate bills that are moving through the session. You can see we'll blow well past most of these. The first date is the official deadline. The bracketed date is what they had amended their joint rules to take account of what was supposed to be a 2-day closure and then turned into a 2-week closure. So it's clear that they clearly have the authority to change those dates if they want, but they also have some other tools at their disposal. And those deadlines are to report out pieces of legislation that have already had public hearings. There are some bills that were raised were scheduled for public hearings that have been canceled, but fortunately, the majority of the bills that we care about, that does not hold true. All of our bills have actually had public hearings, so that clears one significant hurdle to them being heard moving forward. Some of the things that they could do to get some of these bills moving, one, there's a petition process that's set out in the joint rules. So a majority of either chamber could formally petition the committee after its deadline to vote on a vote a bill out of committee. Leadership always has the ability to issue a so-called emergency certification. And that's essentially just the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate, each signing a document saying that this bill is essential, and then it can skip the regular legislative process. And then finally, depending upon when they decide to come back, they can always be called into a special session to continue that work. Typically, the big thing they do any year is the budget. We have our 2-year budget that was passed last year. This year is typically used for tweaks to that. So there's really nothing from a budgetary perspective that would need to be done, certainly before the end of this fiscal year. But that's just all to say everything is still very much in flux. I thought it'd be useful just to quickly walk through sort of some of this background information. This is the state's official 2017 greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The chart on the left sort of shows some milestones about where emissions from the various sectors have been from 1990 to 2017, which is the last year for which we have compiled all of the data. There's usually a 2 or 3 year lag in that data. We are currently on track to meet our greenhouse gas target for 2020. That's a 10% reduction below 1990 levels. If today were 2020, we'd be about 10.5% below that. But that can change. And you can see, transportation, that top line has essentially remained flat. The good news is that's been in the face of rising vehicle miles traveled. So even as we're driving more, our emissions dropped just a tiny bit. We had the biggest gains in the electric power sector. And in fact, those are down about 31% from 2001 levels. The waste sector is a little bit up. And the residential sector has also had some significant reductions as a result of the state's really excellent energy efficiency programs. And the circle on the right, you can see sort of what percentage each sector contributes to our current emissions. So transportation, 38%, electricity, about 21%, and then combined residential and commercial is about 26%. And this just sort of shows you our trajectory in graphic form. You can see even though we're meeting our 2020 target, that curve is relatively shallow. Even being 10.5% below 1990 levels, it's a pretty shallow curve. So clearly there is some work to be done moving forward yet. That being said, there are a bunch of bills that are being heard in the legislature this year. We'll sort of go through them by category and relevant sector, but we'll begin with sort of the broad climate bills that were raised. SB 10 is the governor's bill, and it really has 3 major components to it. The first is establishing a new greenhouse gas target for 2040. The governor had issued an executive order basically calling for carbon-free electricity generation in the state of Connecticut by 2040. This would codify that requirement. It also requires DEEP to assess the efficacy of adopting California's motor vehicle standards for medium duty and heavy duty vehicles. Connecticut has had a great deal of success in following California's lead on our light-duty vehicle standards. Also helps to explain why, despite increasing VMT, emissions in that sector have remained relatively flat. Vehicles are just getting much cleaner. And you may have heard, unfortunately, the current administration in Washington is trying to revoke the state's authority to adopt those standards. Connecticut is working with other states to challenge that, but in the meantime, still moving forward to assert our authority to adopt those standards. And finally, the bill would authorize DEEP to solicit up to 300,000 megawatt hours of energy efficiency, demand response, and energy storage resources annually. So that bill really sort of covers several sectors, the transportation, buildings, as well as the electricity sector. And then SB 354 is a bill that was raised in the Labor Committee, had a public hearing, and it sort of does SB 10 one better, I would say. So again, it establishes that 100% clean electricity goal for 2040. But then it also requires the establishment of zero emission targets for transportation and buildings by 2050. So sort of pushes the envelope a bit on those long-term targets. It establishes interim targets, 5-year benchmark metrics to ensure that the state can continue to assess its progress towards meeting its long-term goals and take corrective action as necessary. It would establish an environmental equity working group to ensure the benefits of transitioning to a clean energy economy are equitably distributed among all of our communities. It establishes a just transition office to ensure that displaced workers are taken cognizance of as we transition to a 100% clean energy economy. And then finally, and I think this is an important piece of this legislation, it establishes accountability measures for all public agencies. And essentially, if for the legislature, it would require a climate change impact note for all legislation. And for any activity by a state agency, would require those agencies to issue statements of compliance with the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets as part of that regulatory and permitting process. So, a very broad piece of legislation. We're anticipating that probably as we face a truncated session, SB 10 will become a broad vehicle for a lot of the climate legislation. We think there'll probably be a lot of funneling, taking of good ideas from various bills, working them into a revised SB 10 as sort of an omnibus energy package. And we're working to ensure that some of the components of that Green New Deal become part of that final package. Moving on specifically to the electricity sector, a number of interesting bills. So House Bill 5351 basically establishes as a state policy the deployment of 1,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. Storage is going to be incredibly important moving forward as we try to meet our broad climate reduction goals. Most people feel that in order to meet our long-term targets, it's going to require broad electrification of both the transportation and the building sector. So clearly you need clean electricity to support the transition to electricity in those other sectors. And because of the intermittent nature of wind and solar resources, energy storage is going to play a critical role in sort of evening out the load as we increase demand moving forward. HB 5349 would allow some limited ownership of solar energy projects by the electric utilities on their own property. Several years ago, we deregulated the electricity sector, which meant that the utilities had to sell off all of their generating units. Today in Connecticut, it's different in other states, but in Connecticut, utilities just own the poles and the wires and some land, but they don't own electricity generation by and large. And this would allow them to own up to an aggregate of 50 megawatts of large-scale solar on their utility lands. And then finally, SB 179, an act concerning the Connecticut Green Bank, an institution that I think we all know and love. They've really been the forefront of using public funds to leverage private capital to expand the deployment of both energy efficiency and renewable energy in the state of Connecticut, with a big focus on solar. This bill would simply allow them to qualify for certain federal funding through the Department of Agriculture to expand their scope and their reach of that work. So because they're a quasi-public entity and not fully a public entity, there appears to be some confusion or restrictions about them actually being able to qualify for some of these federal Department of Agriculture grants. So this would clear up that confusion. Moving on to the transportation sector, as we noted, the biggest sector of emissions in the state of Connecticut. We continue to work to try to expand the deployment of electric vehicles throughout the state as a critical part of cleaning up that sector, both passenger vehicles as well as large transit vehicles. So SB 5226, you can really think of it as a right to charge bill. So this would essentially, one of the big barriers to electric vehicle ownership, if you don't own your own home, if you're living in an apartment or a condo, is access to at-home charging, which is really critical. So this would prohibit any unreasonable restrictions on the installation or use of an electric vehicle charging station by a condominium or homeowners association. They can't unreasonably say no if at your own cost you'd like to install this EV charging infrastructure. And it also permits tenants who are renting to request installation of EV chargers and sets out some process for negotiating with landlords reasonably to do that. But again, sort of referred to frequently as a right to charge legislation. And then going back to our friends, the Green Bank, 5228 regards the state's Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, or CPACE. That's where, under its current frame, if you want to install renewable energy or energy efficiency measures in your residence, you can get a loan to do that. And that loan can essentially be paid off through the savings on your utility bill as a result of those improvements. So it just goes with the property. This would expand the types of projects that are eligible for CPACE financing to include both electric vehicle recharging infrastructure, as well as certain resiliency measures for your home. So this is both a mitigation and a resiliency piece of legislation. So it currently, neither of those types of projects sort of fit within the four corners of a PACE loan. You know, they're not really fixtures that, you know, would be transferred with the property, but this provides a pathway to allow those to sort of be rolled into a PACE loan moving forward, which is great. If you're thinking about a solar installation, for example, and you also want to get some electric vehicle charging infrastructure installed at your property, then that could all be bundled together in one package. Moving on to the building sector. Oh, I've blown way past the building sector, excuse me. There we go. So HB 5008 establishment of high-performance green building standards for voluntary adoption by municipalities. You can think of this as a stretch code, something that Connecticut has been reluctant to adopt in the past, but Massachusetts has had on its books since 2008, and about 200 of their municipalities have adopted a stretch code. Basically, it allows the state to develop high-performance energy efficiency building standards, which go beyond the state-based code, offer them for use by local municipalities, and authorize but don't require the municipalities to adopt those for those local jurisdictions. And these would be based by and large on the high-performance green building standards that the state already requires for use in its own construction project. So there's a good template there and a long history of success in Massachusetts. But because most of our buildings are already built, so that building code would apply most frequently to new construction, SB 177, an act concerning energy consumption, data, and labeling, is a way of improving the energy efficiency and performance of our current building stock. So basically, it would require, at the time of lease or sale, disclosure of the energy characteristics of that building. This would apply both to commercial as well as residential buildings. And it could be complied with in a couple of different ways. You could either provide 12 months worth of utility bills to a prospective tenant or purchaser, or you could undergo what's known as a home energy rating score, or HERS score. And that's sort of a standardized numeric score, which allows people to quickly and easily compare the energy performance of various buildings. So measures designed to address both new and existing buildings. And finally, an act concerning natural gas infrastructure addresses a few of the problems that we currently have with our natural gas expansion program. Number one, we can't really be relying on the expansion of natural gas for building heating if we want to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets. We really need to be thinking ahead towards building electrification, the use of air and ground source heat pumps for our heating and cooling needs. So while this doesn't prohibit or place a moratorium on natural gas infrastructure, it does make a few important changes. First of all, it would repeal the interstate gas infrastructure tax that was applied several years ago, so that Connecticut customers would no longer potentially be on the hook for any expansion of interstate gas infrastructure capacity. And then it also changes the hurdle rate that's applied if natural gas lines are going to be expanded into a new territory, a new neighborhood. The hurdle rate is basically just a cost-benefit analysis of what over the course of X number of years having a new customer on the line will pay back to the utility to see whether the investment in that new infrastructure is worth it. Right now, the hurdle rate is set at 25 years. That was a relatively recent increase from a 10-year hurdle rate, and clearly the longer time frame you're applying, the more beneficial an expansion looks. So this would essentially authorize PURA, direct PURA, to reassess what the appropriate hurdle rate is and authorize them to set it anywhere up to 25 years, but it could be also much lower. So that is, I think, an important reform as we think about where we're heading with our energy infrastructure in the state of Connecticut. And finally, we have a few, few other bills that are sort of fall into not quite any of those specific buckets, although I suppose 178 on energy efficiency standards could apply to buildings or electrification. Basically, these are adopting a whole suite of new appliance and equipment energy efficiency standards. It's a great way to sort of save money, increase efficiency, reduce energy consumption without the consumer or citizen really having to do much. It just requires those products being offered for sale in the state of Connecticut to meet higher energy efficiency standards. And these are products, cover a range of products, which are all readily available, standards that other states have adopted already in other jurisdictions, Massachusetts, California, Vermont. So rather than, really all it would do is remove the worst performing products from sale in the state of Connecticut, and thereby sort of raising the bar a bit. 354 is an insurance bill, which was raised by Matt Lesser, the commissioner or the chairman of the insurance committee. And that essentially requires the insurance industry to evaluate and report on their investments in certain fossil fuel extraction industries. It's really, think of it almost as a consumer protection issue, as we want to ensure that our insurance companies are solvent, are making good investments moving forward. An act concerning the inclusion of climate change instruction in the public school curriculum is self-explanatory. Schools are currently permitted to teach that as part of the science curriculum. And I think it is part of the general statewide science curriculum standards. However, this would make this a mandatory component of that educational process. And then finally, an act requiring an evaluation of the state's environmental justice law. This was raised last year, but didn't make it over the finish line. It has a head start on all of these other bills, as you can see in the green there. It was JF'd, or joint favorably reported, out of its committee on the 28th of February. So it's cleared that hurdle at least. And what this would do is strengthen the state's existing EJ law by requiring, rather than simply authorizing, the specific steps that must be taken in support of a public participation plan. For any municipality that hosts 5 or more polluting facilities already, it requires that facility enter into a community benefits agreement with that town. And then finally, it expands the scope of activities that can be funded through a community benefits agreement. And those can include things like establishing a wellness clinic, ongoing asthma screening, or air monitoring. And because of the uncertainty of what will happen in the next weeks with the legislature, I just wanted folks to be aware that there's also a lot of activity happening in other venues.
Hey, Charles?
Yep.
I'm just going to jump in for a quick sec. I just wanted to pause quickly for questions at this point, and then we'll take the rest of the questions when Charles is done. Let me throw these to you, Charles. Of the bills you just went through, which of them is likely to get passed or has reasonable traction at this point? And if CFE Save the Sound could get one of these passed, which would it be?
So I think there's 2 ways to answer that question. I mean, I think all of these concepts are certainly alive and well. You know, in terms of the actual bill itself, as I mentioned, I think SB 10 is going to be probably a vehicle that a lot of these concepts get poured into. You know, what we'd like to see additionally included with that, I think the accountability standards from the Green New Deal bill would be a critical component for that. I think we will see some expanded authorization for the procurement of storage resources moving forward. You know, I think the energy consumption data and labeling, the building labeling bill, may be a tougher lift, but in lieu of that, I think the stretch code for high performance buildings for municipalities has a really good chance. One of the things that we're facing in this sort of new landscape is it's very likely that anything that moves forward this session, unless something changes dramatically, will really be part of negotiation by all four caucuses. So Senate and House Democrats and Senate and House Republicans. And I think that they will be looking to really have a very smooth adoption of legislation moving forward. Although there may certainly be exceptions to the rule, I think by and large, they're going to be looking for unanimous consent among all four caucuses, particularly if they're changing the traditional legislative process. You know, part of that change will likely be a reduced ability and access for the public to engage with the legislative process. So I think they're going to be very cognizant of not doing things that are incredibly controversial as a result of that. And I can just go through these other things super quickly and then open it up just for general questions. So DEEP is still working on its 2018 question mark, exclamation mark, integrated resources plan. It's a little bit behind schedule. But as part of that, some exciting things. They're looking at alternatives to participating in the regional wholesale energy market, ISO New England, talking about maybe pulling out and going it alone so that we can actually increase the amount of renewable resources we procure. Right now, the federal rules that ISO is bound by limit the ability of renewable resources to participate against fossil fuels in that market. We're looking at a thermal renewable portfolio standard for our building sector, which would be a complement to our electricity RPS. And finally, some pathways to achieve our zero carbon electricity goals. The Transportation and Climate Initiative is a proposal by 12 New England's Northeast states and DC, sort of a complement to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It would be a cap and invest program for transportation fuels. We continue to work on the statewide EV roadmap and disperse VW settlement funds to increase the electrification of our fleet here in Connecticut. And then, of course, we have ongoing procurements of offshore wind. Last year, up to 2,000 megawatts was authorized. We just are finishing the contracts for about 800 megawatts of that. And then, as we noted, additional demand response. And at Pura, we're looking at ways to more equitably value distributed energy resources, small scale solar, energy efficiency, so it can compete against renewable resources. We have our shared solar program, which had its final program rules approved in December, and is really designed for folks, maybe renters, who can't otherwise take advantage of solar programs. So we're really pleased the way that program has turned out so far, though it has not yet begun to be implemented. And then finally, a broad grid modernization program. As we said, electrifying transportation, electrifying buildings is critical to meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals. That's likely going to double the load on our grid. So figuring out how to integrate all of these pieces is essential, but somewhat complicated. So Pure is looking at ways to ensure that energy remains affordable, what sort of advanced metering infrastructure we'll need to handle demand response and more integrated variable resources into the grid, battery storage and zero emission vehicles we've already talked about. And then finally, in all of these categories, sort of inviting proposals for innovation pilots that can be proofs of concept moving forward as we really transform what has been a 19th century electricity grid to a 21st and beyond electricity grid. But I think that is all I have. And happy to answer any questions. I know we, despite the fact that we're a little bit over time, went through everything pretty quickly, which is just to say there's a lot going on.
So the floor is now open. Feel free to take yourself off mute and ask a question out loud to Charles, or you can type into the chat and I will do those and ask them to Charles as we have time. So we have a couple questions already coming in, Charles, on chat. Yeah, a question from Richard. Is there ever any discussion of sea level rise and how the state will assist towns in dealing with it?
Yes. There is a healthy discussion about sea level rise in the context of adaptation and resiliency. There's actually a legislative coastal caucus that focuses on that a lot, co-chaired by Senator Cohen. But I think the focus of what I was doing was really more on the mitigation side. So I apologize not giving enough due to the adaptation and resilience side of this. But absolutely, I mean, Connecticut is actually going to be ironically disproportionately impacted by sea level rise as we move forward, just because of geography and the way that the ocean works. We can expect almost 2 feet of sea level rise here in Connecticut by 2050. And when you look at sort of not only the real estate, but the transportation infrastructure that we have along our coasts, that is going to be critical.
Okay. Another question. Have public hearings been postponed at this point?
Yes. So everything has been postponed at this point. The building is closed 100% until at least the 30th. As we mentioned, all the bills we went through just now have already had public hearings. So the only issue with them is actually getting them voted out of the committee. But as we said, there are workarounds certainly available to the legislature to do that. I'm not sure how many bills are still hanging out there that haven't had a public hearing. And you know, I've been watching the news and reading the tea leaves as much as anybody. I don't think the legislature, even if they come back on the 30th, quite knows what the plan is. You know, how they're going to handle public hearings, whether they will allow the public back into the building, or they're going to try to move things to a more online, submit your comments electronically sort of role. It's just, you know, it changes daily and no decision has been made. So I wish I had better information for you, but that is currently where we stand.
Do you think they'll extend the session, Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably inevitable at this point. So the by state constitution, they have to adjourn on, what was it, May 6th. But they could, you know, gavel out and then gavel back in immediately in special session. So really, there's, you know, they have a lot of flexibility as to what they do. You know, I think a lot of it will depend upon, you know, I think leaders are talking on Monday to try to figure out what the next few weeks look like. If they come back on the 30th, I think there's plenty that they can do to get business moving, and a special session may not be necessary, even though that only gives them 6 weeks. But if it's any later than the 30th, yeah, I think a special session is probably inevitable.
Okay. So at this point, with public hearings done and testimony submitted on many of these bills, what's the best way for folks on this call and the public in general to influence the course of the bills that we just talked about?
Yeah, so everything is moving online, and this, although this has always been a great strategy when it comes to the legislature, you know, I would say phone calls maybe aren't the best because I don't think there's any staff in the building, but certainly folks are continuing to work via email. So, you know, as I said, legislative leaders have asked their committee chairs for their priorities, thinking that probably there's going to be a lot of triaging of stuff, and you know, if they are back outside of a special session, if they come back on the 30th, I think they're going to want to focus on what the top priority is. So emailing your local legislators and emailing the leadership of the legislature as well as the committees to express what you feel the priority should be is going to be critically important. That may be the only opportunity maybe folks have depending upon where things go. So just making sure that they're hearing from you so that when they're talking with their committee members, when they're talking with leadership, they can point to, it's like, hey, well, I think, that 100 people emailing me about this piece. So yeah, I would say that's a priority.
Yeah. Couple quick ones. Point of clarification, it's the sea level rise expected in Connecticut is 2050, is that correct, or 40?
2050, right. It's 20 inches by 2050 is the statistics I've seen.
Okay. And a couple more specific questions coming through. Can you comment on why green building standards aren't mandatory at this point?
Well, having had some dealings with the state building code council, I can say, inertia. I mean, Connecticut is the land of steady habits, and the state building code authority is relatively conservative, I think, as a whole. Our standards have evolved over time, but the way building codes are adopted, there's a national code committee, which sort of produces comprehensive texts, and those are revised every 2 or 3 years. Although there have been lots of efforts over the years to get Connecticut to go beyond what the National Code Council sort of establishes as the standard, those have been unsuccessful. And we continue to adopt the latest iteration of the national codes, but when it comes to doing anything innovative that might go beyond that, there's just been, I wouldn't say unanimously no interest. I mean, certain members of the council have been more interested in doing this than others. But when you talk about educating building code officials, when they're hearing from home builders and folks in the trades about having to apply different standards in different jurisdictions, I think that sort of cools the enthusiasm for doing anything that's a little bit innovative. That being said, I'm kind of with you. If we had a green building code that was statewide, it seems to me that's a much better approach than a stretch code that sort of municipalities can adopt on their own, because I think that actually causes more confusion among the trades than the former. But, incremental progress. And, at a certain point, as I mentioned, in Massachusetts, now 200 municipalities have adopted that. And although I'm not familiar personally, one has to assume that at that point, it sort of has become the de facto statewide code. It wouldn't make sense otherwise, but yeah,
Okay.
so.
Maybe one last question here. And this is an interesting question. What is Save the Sound's position on lobbying the state to focus current or future grid solar initiatives on developing areas that are already impervious surfaces, buildings, box stores, that kind of thing, rather than or agricultural land?
I would say, yeah, unreservedly that placing large solar installations on already impervious surfaces, as well as brown fields, rather than green fields, is a much better choice. That should definitely be the first place you're looking.
And so thanks very much, Charles. This was really great. And for folks on the line who want to continue to follow along with all of these bills, maybe online, tracking them through the legislator website, or what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so the state General Assembly, www.cga.gov for Connecticut General Assembly, has a pretty easily navigable website. You can look for sort of bill info, and there's a drop-down menu. Just type in the number, and it'll bring up everything about that bill. There are also ways to sign up for a tracking service.
All right. Thanks again, Charles. Thanks to everyone for joining and for the great questions. Stay well out there, stay healthy, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.
Excellent. Thank you all.